Ladies and gentlemen, this presentation was prepared for a talk at a conference in Kiel on May 25th. Unfortunately, this talk could not take place. The idea of the talk was to speak about the relationship between thinking and feeling. In my opinion, these are not separated units. Instead, they build a union. And I argue for three theses. This is the Russian colonel Stanislav Petrov, known as the man who saved the world. It happens in the early 80s. This was a highlight of the Cold War, and at this time the Russian computers reported that a missile had been launched from the United States, and the responsible commander, the responsible colonel, was Stanislav Petrov. And based on his gut feelings, he decided that this was a false alarm. So my first thesis is that, based on this example, that efficient human choice behavior demands gut feelings. Rational decision theory is not really appropriate for the modeling of efficient human choice behavior. Now, this is my second example. This is a bone flute, 40,000 years old, found in the Neanderthal and used by the Homo sapiens. This is a reconstruction of the flute, and in the internet you can find many examples where you can listen to the sound produced by this flute. So the question related to this is, why do we like music? It's so old that we like music. With the beginning of humans, music came in, was born. And one idea that goes back to Robert Satora is that music affects the reward system, and there is a dopamine release that occurred in the subcortex during the presentation of music. So the next point is that the capacity to understand music is a cognitive capacity. It has to do with thinking, and this capacity is necessary to induce emotional feelings. So my second thesis is that the cognitive system of music affects our feelings. So my third point is consciousness. Of course, you know that consciousness is a very ambiguous term. It can mean excess consciousness, how we remember an item from our memory in a conscious way. The second is phenomenal consciousness, also known as qualia. Then we have self-consciousness, and finally spiritual consciousness. The main idea is now, when a picture or a piece of music creates conscious feelings, then more resources are allocated to the emotional event. That is the function of consciousness, to allocate resources. So that is the third thesis. Consciousness feelings affects the allocation of cognitive resources. So then is the structure of the presentation. The first point relates to the first thesis. Efficient human choice behavior demands feeling. This is the way feelings influence our thinking. Together with Peter beim Graben, I wrote a lengthy paper about this, so in this presentation I will not really speak about it. The second is musical expectation. This is a kind of thinking. To build expectations is a kind of thinking. And I think that musical expectation is essential for the development of aesthetic feelings, for the fun we have with listening to music. So this is the opposite to the first point. It's now that thinking affects our feelings, not that our feelings affect thinking. It's in the opposite way. Thinking affects our feelings, and the last point is the role of consciousness. And I think that emotions can be triggered non-consciously, but they cannot continue without our core consciousness. And conscious feelings, their function is conscious feelings allocate resources to the emotional. So let me start with music and feelings. There are many ideas that relate to the relationship between music and feelings. For example, music is what feelings sound like, or music speaks when words cannot express your feelings. So in some sense, the idea is that music is a language of our feelings, or that the meaning of music are the elicited or expressed feelings. So many people like these ideas, but I think in some sense all these ideas are complete nonsense, and I agree with the famous German critic Hanslick, who said music and feelings are not related in this way. So let me come to another point that's related to that language and music can be considered as representational systems. As you know, language has referential meanings. A word like dog means some particular animal. And further, language has a connotation. The connotation is very different from this referential meaning. Let's explain it with the color red. If you hear the word red, it has a meaning. It's a particular perception, a particular qualia, if you want, but the connotation is very different. The word red, the connotation is a warm feelings, it has to do with fire or something like that. So connotation and referential meaning are quite different. In language, the referential meaning is the most important. It's given by a code. It's necessary to have a lexicon that established this code, and some people like the expression that it's a non-natural meaning. And in music, the referential meaning is the exception. There are a few examples that signal referential meaning, but that's not the dominant. The dominant is affective meaning. That's what earlier was called connotation. It's no code. In music you do not have a lexicon. Instead you can speak of a natural meaning. It relates to the old example, smoke means fire. It's a natural connection between these two things. So again, as I stressed, in language the referential meaning is dominant. In music the affective meaning is the dominant one. That's the difference. So next, let's come to the doctrine of effects. In some sense, it relates to the thesis I rejected, that there is a lexicon in music. No, that's what I reject. There is no lexicon in music, but the doctrine of effects assumes, yes, there is something like a lexicon. The inventor was René Descartes. In his Compendium of Music, he wrote, the basis of music is sound. Its aims is to please and to arouse various emotions in us. And the doctrine of effects is an old Baroque practice that relates music with various emotions, a mapping between musical elements and various emotions. And the idea dates back already to the ancient Greek and the teachings of the temperament. Let me give some examples. According to Descartes, the rhythm of music is intended to evoke such a mood in our soul, which is similar to the mood expressed in music. For example, slow rhythm, soft and weary feelings, dejection, sadness; fast rhythm, lively and cheerful feelings such as joy. Another example goes back to Johann Mattheson, who was a leading proponent of the doctrine of music. He wrote the book Der vollkommene Kapellmeister, and in this book he proposed a thorough outline of melodic intervals and their effective purposes. For example, the major third relates to liveliness, the minor third to mourning, the fifth to boldness, and the seventh to supplication. So there is a direct mapping between musical elements and emotional. So I will consider bass cantata as an example. I will the cross stuff gladly cover. I consider two parts. The first part is this. The first line, it's in major chord, and the second part is relates to the second line, which has many dissonances in it. So, some comments. The cross stuff, also called Jakob stuff, can mean two different things. First, it's a navigation instrument that was used before the invention of the sextant, illustrated in this picture here. And the secondary interpretation is an allegorical use of the term Kreuzstab, referring to the suffering of Christ's passion. And we find these opposed elements in the two first elements of this music, the green and the red part. These are opposed effects within one particular composition. The first is the positive emotions due to the major chords, joy, elation, in the first 2.5 measure, and the second is pain and sadness in the remaining measures. And what you find here is a close correspondence between text and music, and you can take this to establish something like a lexical relationship between elements of music and elements of emotions. So, but I see many problems with this doctrine, and for that reason I will reject the doctrine. The first problem is what I call the contextual puzzle. Depending on previous context, the chords sound very different. A strict mapping thesis cannot account for this contextual observation. The second is a failure of systematicity. A list of associations can describe the situation, however, it cannot explain the situation. And the third is what we can call the failure of embodiment. This described system is purely symbolic and not embodied. And the last point I will mention is the limited expressibility. Not every emotion can be expressed by music. For example, we cannot distinguish anger and fear in music. Now we have one more example, the myth of discrete emotions, infinite sets of emotions with a defined similarity. Music. So we do not have a finite set, we have an infinite set of emotions, and this cannot handled in this quasi-lexical. I mentioned Descartes is one of the inventors of the doctrine of affects, and I criticized it, and to make this point a little bit more clear, I will refer to Immanuel Kant and Hanslick, who criticized Descartes fundamentally. Kant, for example, developed the conception of aesthetic ideas, that is the conception of the beautiful as an interplay of sensuality and reason connecting thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling are not separate units, they form a union. This is the idea of Immanuel Kant, and it's the core of the idea of aesthetic feelings or aesthetic ideas, how he calls it. Next is Edward Hanslick. He has interesting thesis that the content of music is not the real feeling it elicits, but the related aesthetic idea. He used this term of Kant, the related aesthetic idea resulting from the intrinsic dynamics of a piece of music. And he writes, definite feelings and emotions are unsusceptible of being embodied in music. The physiological process by which the sensations of sound is converted into a feeling, a state of mind, is unexplained and will ever remain so. Let us never appeal to a science for explanations which it cannot possibly give. And I think this is a very modern view, and let's consider some ideas developed by Jocelyn and Sloboda in 213 that show how complex the relationship between feelings and emotions can be. We have many different systems that relate musical elements to emotional elements. A brainstem reflects rhythm, entrainment. I will not explain all this concept. Visual, imagery, evaluative condition, episodic memory, and musical expectancy. Musical expectations play a fundamental role, and what I think that we can interpret Hanslick in this way, it's much too complex for a single explanation. We have to consider a special part of it, and then we can describe the effects of music. And I think musical expectancy is the most important of these elements. And what we can try to do is to make the relationship between musical expectancy and emotional ideas triggered by musical expectations. And that's what I have to explain. So now I come to explain the relationship between music, feelings, and expectations. There are many different views about this relationship. For example, Hindemith says that expectation is central to the aesthetic effects of music. We derive pleasure from having our expectations met. In contrast, Meyer said emotions are born of conflict and frustration. The emotional effect of music does not come from having our expectations met, but from having them more or less thwarted. And David Horn, based on the ideas of Meyer, proposed that the justification of Meyer's theory can be given with the help of evolutionary biology. So, to explain the idea of Meyer, we consider the following smoking example. For smokers, the availability or non-availability of cigarettes has a positive or negative value. And then he has a short story. A man reaches into his pocket for a cigarette, but he has none. Then he discovers that there are none in the house and sees that it's late and the shops are closed. This steady frustration of his desire creates first restlessness, then irritation, and finally anger. Just then his friend knocks on the door and turns out to have a packet of cigarettes in his coat. Anger and anxiety give rise to joy and life. So we have a simple emotional style, a neutral region, positive or negative emotions, and if the expectations are met, then positive emotions become weaker, and also negative emotions go more to the neutral region. And if they are not met, if it's not expected, then positive emotions are much more positive and negative emotions are much negative. And this is a simple picture we come with. So for listeners of music, consonance and dissonance has a positive or negative value on a scale of valence. So we relate this to a scale of valence with positive emotions for consonance and negative emotions for dissonance. And if the consonance is expected in our piece of music, then the positive emotions become much stronger than in case if they are not expected, they are stronger. If they are expected, they are weaker. And the same in the negative direction. If a dissonance is expected, then it's more closer to the neutral region. And if a dissonance is not expected, then it sounds, if you want, much more dissonance. If it's not expected, the negative value becomes stronger. There's an interesting recent experiment that extends, as a smoking example, to the domain of music. In this experiment, subjects rated the pleasantness of chords. So that means he did not rate how consonant or how dissonant it is, they rated how pleasant the chord is. This is a procedure. The presentation takes sequences from about 700 popular pop songs, all transposed to C major. 30 chord progressions were formed, each consisting of 30 to 38 chords. The melody and rhythm were removed from the original songs, and only the chord progressions were kept. Songs. Then 39 pedals listened to about 1,000 chords in the progression, and the subject rated the pleasantness of each chord using a mechanical slider, non-pleasant to very pleasant. And no subjects mentioned that the chord progressions in the stimuli were familiar to them. These are the results. The rule seems to be that high uncertainty leads listeners to enjoy something conventional, whereas low uncertainty leads listeners to enjoy something novel. This is an illustration. Let's consider this implicative context as standard consonants, and the consonants events is a simple G major chord in this case, or that is the contrast in a flat major. G major, A flat major, and I think the impression is that the A flat major, the unexpected chord, sounds more beautiful than the expected G major chord. So I skip this example. And now let's come to a more realistic example from the Robert Schumann Fantasia in C major. Let's listen to it. A flat major. No. Contrasted with the own composition, where instead of A flat major we have C major, and then it sounds like that. Now the expected C major. C major. A flat major. It's very obvious that this sounds much more beautiful. So now let's come to the results. Uncertainty and surprise are the key factors making music enjoyable. On the right hand side you see a simple picture. On the axis from left to right to have different values of uncertainty, the context with high uncertainty and with low uncertainty on the left hand side, and in the direction from bottom to up you see the surprise of the target chord. And in predictive context, that means low uncertainty, left-hand side, this context leads listeners to enjoy something novel. High pleasure is indicated by a red color, low pleasure by a blue color. This gives high pleasure for surprising chords. And on the other hand, for non-predictive context, this context leads listeners to enjoy something that is conventional. There's also a neural basis of pleasure, and this comes to light when we consider the interaction between uncertainty and surprise, and this interaction highly correlates with the blood oxygen level dependent. That's a response typical in the amygdala and the hippocampus. So finally, let me make some remarks about the role of consciousness. I said already that consciousness is in very ambiguous terms, and so there is a need of clarification what it really means. And the first interpretation of consciousness is attentiveness, including the ability to differentiate whether the object of cognition is internal or external, and this is called access consciousness. Second, consciousness is raw experience realizing our qualia. This is phenomenal consciousness. Third, consciousness as mechanism for constructing ourselves, self-consciousness. And finally, spiritual consciousness, connoting the relationship between the mind and God, and including the experience of meditation. And there are some other interpretations, for example, as a stream of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, animal consciousness, and so on. So I will be concerned only with the first two notions of consciousness, access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Now let me give some remarks about emotions, feelings, and neural circuits. And the basic idea goes back to Damasio, that emotions can be triggered non-consciously, but they cannot continue without some kind of core consciousness. And this is a simplification of the relevant circuits that matter. We have a smaller black one and a bigger red one. And the black one is the circuit of emotions, a simple feed-forward nets starting with a stimulus, for example, a visual stimulus, goes to the thalamus, amygdala, hypothalamus, and the brainstem. And the bigger one is the one indicated in red on my picture, the circuit of feelings. So feelings are conscious in contrast to emotions that also can be unconscious. And the circuit of feelings is this bigger one. It starts again with some stimulus, for example, a visual stimulus, goes to the thalamus, neocortex, prefrontal cortex, and to the brainstem. And further, it has some recurrent connections indicated by the double arrow in my picture. And this indicates the recurrent net connecting areas of the visual cortex. So, for better understanding, it's a good idea to have a look at visual awareness, and I will introduce the phenomenon of visual crowding. Look at this plus in the upper line, and then I guess you will see, if you concentrate on the plus, that this circle on the right has a diagonal grading. But now look at the plus at the bottom, and then you have not only one circle in the centers, you have four other circles, and in this case you cannot see the diagonal grading in the middle. And this is an interesting phenomenon called visual crowding. When viewed in the peripheral visual field, fixations on the cross, the diagonal grading is visible on its own, but is unrecognizable when surrounded by neighboring gradings. And I think this phenomenon should be best treated within a general theory of resource limitation of conscious experience. In the second case, you have four circles or 5 circles, and resource limitation says that the circle in the middle cannot process so deeply as in the first case shown in the upper line. What has that to do with consciousness? I think consciousness indicates, a bigger consciousness indicates that the figure that is processed is more in the center, as in this picture. And conscious feelings allocate resources to the emotional event. I think this is an obvious thesis in this connection. Conscious feelings allocate resources to the emotional event, for example, the perception of these circles in my visual example. And evidence for this fact is given by a paradigm of divided attention. For example, divided attention, for example, the simultaneous processing of emotional events. That means the pictures or the circles in this example, and recognition of a pitch signal. This is a secondary task, right? This is a standard task for measuring divided attention. And there's also there are also ERP studies that confirm this finding. Finally, I would like to refer to a recent book by Leonid Perlovsky, Music, Passion and Cognitive Function. In this book, Perlovsky discusses the function of feelings and music, and claims that conscious feelings and music can help to overcome cognitive dissonances and to unify the inner world. And this may be a phylogenetic argument for the parallel evolution of consciousness, musical styles, and continued cultural development. So, a summary, I think Descartes' basic error is the strict separation of thinking and feeling. Efficient human choice behavior demands gut feelings. That's what I did not really discuss in the present talk. And second, musical expectation, that means a kind of thinking. Expectation is a kind of thinking. Musical expectation is essential for the development of aesthetic feelings. And the role of consciousness is a threefold: conscious feelings allocate resources to the emotional event. Emotion can be triggered non-consciously, but they cannot continue without core consciousness. And finally, evolutionary advantage of emotional music has to do with the overcoming of cognitive dissonances. And there is a big problem that I should mention finally. If we have this embodied perspective, that means mind and body are two aspects of one and the same unit, then what we need is an integration, in some sense, integration of Eastern and Western thinking in order to realize this embodied perspective. And it needs a novel theoretical perspective to consciousness in the sense of the Dutch researcher Victor Lammer. Thank you for your attention.